morning, everyone. Welcome to the online learning channel. My name is Brad, and I will be assisting you today with English, specifically focusing on the grade 12 curriculum. For today's lesson, what we're going to be focusing on is the aspect of writing and presenting. So what I have for you guys is a PowerPoint presentation that I'd just like to share with you that focuses on the aspect of writing and presenting, but more specifically looking at the idea of transactional texts. So now when it comes to transactional texts, these are essentially texts or writing pieces that you'll come across in paper 3 in your upcoming examination. So with regards to the transactional texts, let us begin. All right, so there we have it. So the focus and objective for today's lesson, as mentioned, is not only on the aspect of writing and presenting and everything that goes with that, but of course, more specifically, the focus will be on transactional texts. So with regards to transactional texts, as previously mentioned, this will typically be assessed in paper 3. And for today's lesson, what we're going to be doing is going through a couple of examples of what those transactional texts may look like, what kind of examples you may come across, and ideally, what would be the best approach from your side as the students in terms of just choosing what particular transactional text suits your needs best. Okay, so what we have here is a table of transactional texts that just essentially illustrate the different types. So as you can see on the left-hand column, we have the category of text when it comes to transactional pieces. So let us go through this list and just elaborate. So first and foremost, you may come across a transactional text that makes mention of a letter to the press. This may be in the form of a formal letter or an informal letter. So if you were just to explain the dynamics behind this particular letter to the press or a formal or informal letter, it's often a request, an application, a business, say, orientated piece, a complaint, looking for sympathy, congratulatory like text, or even a word of thanks. This can all essentially form part of the theme that would typically define your particular piece. Then moving on to the second category, you can come across what is known as CV and covering letters. Okay, so CVs, typically pieces of information that highlight your experience in the working world, or even if you are a student, any kind of experience that you have acquired up until this point in time, whether it be within your actual schooling environment or whether it be out in the public, volunteering or participating in any kind of part-time work. Essentially, the covering letter will be a piece that is written by the candidates that is now applying to whatever, say, job application they deem fit. And it's essentially an opportunity for you as the employee, excuse me, to introduce yourself and just give the employer a sense as to who you are and how best you would fit the kind of the candidacy when it comes to applying for jobs. So the next point being mentioned there is the idea of an obituary. Now remember, an obituary is not the same as a eulogy. An obituary is essentially a piece that is written to commemorate the life of someone that has now passed away. So a eulogy is often a piece that is written in the form of a speech that is given at an actual funeral or any kind of gathering that now mourns those that have passed. So an obituary is just essentially a piece that's written to commemorate and give thanks and praise whoever may be mentioned for the contributions that they have made in that particular person's life. Then going on to the next category, we have what's known as formal and informal reports or reviews. Again, this is something that an organization could request from its employees, or someone that is now potentially part of an organization that's now looking to provide feedback on whatever activity took place, whatever, say, event unfolded that now requires some form of feedback or some form of report. You may come across newspaper, magazine articles, editorials. Those all form part and parcel of your typical, say, newspaper. There may be an agenda that you are expected to put together specifically for the purposes of a meeting. And then, of course, the minutes of a meeting is often a common practice that many people undertake when it comes to professionalism and when it comes to just documenting any kind of discussions or any kind of decisions that have been made within an organization, whatever the nature of that organization may be. Then the last category, you may come across what's known as dialogue. Okay, this may be in the form of informal, say, conversation, or formal conversation in the form of an interview or a speech. Again, it could be an informal speech, but remember, when one is doing a speech, it often is the case that you are addressing an audience for a specific purpose and a specific reason. So you don't want to make it too informal at the end of the day. Okay, so transactional texts, what we'll be focusing on today is essentially the structure, so the format and the layout of the actual piece, together with the tone and the style of the transactional pieces that are commonly assessed in paper 3 in particular. So note in this particular section, you do need to choose 2 transactional pieces, both worth 25 marks each. Okay, so with regards to the topics, you need to choose 2 texts that are most familiar with you. So again, it's an opportunity for you guys to now ideally identify a topic that best suits your needs or best suits your experiences. Often is the case that if you can write from experience, this is going to be a lot easier than essentially coming up with a kind of fictional story on the spot. That does require a bit of time, a bit of thinking, a bit of thought process. But if you do have an experience that you'd like to share now with the examiner, that is often the case in terms of just getting it on paper as soon as possible in a nice, coherent fashion. All right, so the types of text that you could essentially pick or choose within the actual piece. Like mentioned earlier, an informal letter could be a friendly letter to a colleague or a friend, a formal letter, the letter to the press, an obituary, a speech, a review, magazine article, editorial, covering letter and CV, agenda and minutes of a meeting, or a formal or informal report. So we're going to be highlighting a couple of these examples later on in the slides, and essentially we're going to be elaborating on what a typical example of these particular texts would look like. So what we have today is a sample of an informal letter that is now being pieced together. So let's have a look as to what this informal letter now looks like. Okay, so as you can see on the left-hand column, where you see that this is a letter to a friend. So this is typically the layout and the structure that you would now have to follow in terms of piecing together this particular letter. So first and foremost, we need to establish the address to which the writer is writing from. So in this particular case, it's the home address, 621 Nelson Mandela Drive, Pietermaritzburg, postal code 3201, and it is being written on the 15th of June, 2020. Okay, so what you do then is that you leave a line, as you can see there, indicated in the actual, say, table. There's an open line between the actual address and your initial statement. So your initial statement would be addressing whoever will be the recipient of your letter. In this case, it is Nombuso. So you would start off with, Dear Nombuso. You would then leave another line, and then you would elaborate on your particular letter in the form of a paragraph. So in this particular case, China is now making mention of the fact that, ever heard about tales around the evening fire? Well, my friend, what I'm going to tell you is not one of these tales, and neither is it a tall story. So clearly it's been addressed, or clearly Nombuso is being addressed in a way that would create some kind of excitement or some kind of, say, wonder as to what exactly China is now referring to. You would then leave another line between the first paragraph and the second. My Uncle Samuel single-handedly saved a lamb from the jaws of a marauding lion. So clearly this is a dramatic event that is now taking place in China's life that he's now wishing to share with Nombuso. So you would leave then another line and continue to elaborate. I'm sure that you are still recovering from the gruesome details of my uncle's experience. We can chat further about this when you visit me this holiday. Okay, so just summing up the point of his actual piece, you leave then another line and you end off with yours sincerely. In this case, it is China. The second piece is a letter to a relative. So again, The actual, say, address is indicated in the first few lines, as you can see there. Not only is it the address, but the actual, say, suburb together with the actual postal code. All right, in this case, it's Dear Uncle Sagren. Okay, so I hope that you have fully recovered the use of your right hand since the encounter with the lion. You can only imagine how the number of my Facebook likes increased when I posted the picture of you in hospital posing with a picture of Simba by your side, clearly referring to the lion in this particular case, or the marauding lion. You then leave another line open. My life orientation project for this term is to identify someone in the community who can be referred to as a hero and interview them. So clearly, um, China has now identified Uncle Sagren as the recipient of this particular heroism. I look forward to hearing from you, Uncle Sagren. And then once again, a line is left open, and then your loving niece, China. All right, good. So that was a example of a letter to not only a friend, but of course, a family relative. So now this is an example of a letter to the press, a formal letter at that. And without further ado, let's now tune in to see what exactly this particular structure would look like. So as you can see, the letter is now being addressed to the editor of this particular press or this particular newspaper. The address, once again, is being mentioned by the actual, say, writer themselves, but then a line is left open, and then it is the actual address of the newspaper itself. So you're going to have to obviously do a little bit of research if you are thinking about addressing a newspaper as to what that particular address may be. So, sir, madam, in this particular case, you leave a line open. You would then elaborate on a particular, say, story or a particular event that has now caught your attention or that you feel strongly about. In this particular case, it's made mention of the fact that the coronavirus is on the rise and the concerns surrounding that. You would then leave another line open. You would elaborate on the concerns, not only within your own community, but perhaps on a national scale, and what the implications are from an economic point of view. And then, of course, not only an economic point of view, but a social point of view. You would then, again, leave open a line, and then you would conclude this particular piece with something along the lines of a phrase such as concerned citizen or yours faithfully, followed by your actual title. So in this case, it is K. Sibonyoni. So an application for a vacant post. Okay, so this is someone that is clearly seeking out a job and is now looking to apply. So again, they've mentioned their own home address. They've left a line open. They've then included the actual address of the employer that they are now applying to for this particular vacancy. A line is left open. It is then started off with Sir, Madam, or you may refer to the idea of Dear Mr. and Mrs. Smith in this particular case. You would then leave another line open. You would then elaborate on your actual reasoning behind the application for the vacancy. You would introduce yourself. You would just perhaps highlight a couple of skills that you now possess that are in line with the actual job application or the job reference, and how it is that you would best suit this particular role. You would then leave another line open. Then you would elaborate further on any kind of experiences that you may have had in the past that would now, again, contribute to your, say, readiness to take on this particular role. You would then leave another line open, and you would conclude with yours faithfully. In this case, it is Miss K. Katlejo. Okay, so the next example that we're going to be looking at is a formal report. So again, a formal report is often a piece that is now drafted and put together courtesy of an individual and organization that has now been tasked to report on a particular, say, experience or a particular event, or just providing some feedback on any kind of experiences they may have had within that organization. Okay, so in this particular case, what I've done for you guys is I've provided an example of what a report could look like. In this particular case, it goes as follows. You have been nominated to prepare a report for the school governing body to determine the need for a school cafeteria that will serve hot meals and beverages to learners and members of staff of ABC Secondary. You are then to write the final report that will be submitted to the chairperson of the school governing body. Okay, so clearly there's been a need identified within this particular school community. There's been a notion drafted that It is something that will both serve not only the students, but also the actual staff members. But of course, as protocol requires, you need to now run it by the actual school governing body so as to allow them to assess the viability of this particular cafe and whether or not it can, in fact, go ahead. Okay, so the actual report itself. So first and foremost, you would need to mention the subject of the report. So in this particular case, the viability of introducing a yearbook for learners of ABC Secondary. Okay, so this is another example. So you would then address it to the actual principal, the staff, and members of the school governing body. It is then, of course, indicated who exactly is preparing this piece. It is being prepared by Kevin Naidu. In this particular case, you need to identify the dates that you'll be submitting the actual piece, the 23rd of April, 2019, as an example. And then, of course, you would have to provide some background as to why exactly you are piecing this report together. So ABC Secondary has not had a yearbook in its 39 years of existence. So a school that has clearly been around for a significant amount of years, but hasn't necessarily documented its history in a nice, concise, and comprehensive manner. So not all grade 12 learners participate in the school dance, and with the exception of class photos, many of the learners have very little photographic records of their school days. So again, any organization or any schooling environment would typically go about the notion of documenting events and experiences that their students experienced at the end of the day. And it's always a good idea to allow the students to reflect on those times once, of course, they have left that schooling environment. So a school magazine has not been printed for more than 25 years. Okay, so for 25 years, there's been an absence of a school magazine. So the purpose of the report, you would then have to mention the purpose. So this report has been commissioned by the principal of ABC Secondary, and the purpose is to determine the viability of introducing the idea of an annual yearbook. The principal is of the view that this report should be completed by a grade 12 learner, as grade 12 learners will be the focus group for this particular year group. So clearly it's been identified that the actual grade 12s themselves would now put this together as a kind of project of sorts, considering that this is the most senior group within the schooling environment, and it would be a nice fitting send-off for them to now leave a little bit of a legacy in this particular case by piecing together a yearbook so that others may follow in the future. So the scope and limitations of the report, well, the report needed to be completed in 7 days, and there was therefore not enough time to conduct a detailed survey on practical or financial ramifications of the project. So this is something that is now being reported, the fact that so little time was now allocated for this piece to be essentially drafted and finalized, and essentially without any kind of practical or financial, say, research into the ramifications, it just simply could not go ahead. So what needed to happen was a data collection or survey in order to identify whether this would be a popular, say, project to embark on. So the RCL representative from each class was then tasked to determine the number of children in each class who wanted a yearbook for 2019. Always a good idea to get the kind of thoughts and the ideas and the feedback from the actual, say, students themselves. The survey was conducted during school hours under the supervision of the class teacher. Learners were then asked to raise their hands in response to the questions, and the responses were then recorded on a class list. So clearly this is a process that the teacher deemed fit in order to bring about a kind of sense of data collection in order to fulfill the survey. Then, of course, the conclusion or the results, it was found that 186 learners in grade 12 this year, 170 of the 186 learners in grade 12 this year, 171 felt that the yearbook was an ideal way to capture the memories of grade 12. So clearly a popular choice amongst this particular grade. However, only 58 learners were confident of securing sponsorship to cover the cost of the yearbook. So clearly this is something that is causing some concern amongst a significant group of grade 12 learners. Reasons given by others include the testing economic climate of the country and the negative reports of the school in the local newspapers. So essentially, people are now looking at the kind of social ramifications that are currently evident within this particular community, and some are essentially voicing their concern as to whether or not this can in fact go ahead. So the school management team and the school governing body need to address the issue of how to deal with the effects of the negative reports in the media. I think this is a primary focus that has now been identified by this particular institution, so as to now clear their name and bring about a positive, say, persona or positive image of their particular, say, schooling environment. An attempt should be made to make the project a reality this year. The recommendation, therefore, is that the school governing body should subsidize 40% of the cost of the yearbooks. So put aside some funds, make them available for this particular year group to put together an actual, say, yearbook, and essentially capture their memories and leave a legacy that will now continue for many, many years to come. Yours sincerely, Kevin Naidu. All right, so that's an example of a formal report. We then move on to the next transactional text, and this is a typical example of an interview. So now remember, an interview is something that typically takes place when someone is applying for a job, in whatever sector it may be. But again, remember, in previous, say, lessons, I have made mention of the fact that it can be in the form of a TV or radio interview that one embarks on. For these purposes, we're going to be focusing on a job interview. So if you do not get the opportunity to interview somebody on television or radio, normal conversation usually involves asking leading questions to show your interest in a person or to sustain conversation. So you can think about it in a kind of social context as well. If you do meet someone for the first time and you ask them questions about themselves, essentially you are interviewing them at the end of the day. Writing a transcript of an interview means writing the entire conversation in dialogue form, indicating the names in full each time. Okay, so with regards to a couple of guidelines that concern interviews, you must have a heading indicating who was interviewed and by whom. It would be useful to include the date and the place of the interview. It's also important that the interviewer shows the following qualities: an interest in the issue, an interest in what is being said, an understanding of the issues of what is being said, the ability to analyze and interpret information, the ability to ask questions based on research or understanding, the ability to ask probing questions so that the interviewee does not simply answer with yes or no responses. Be polite but firm. It is better not to have a lengthy monologue as answers. This ensures easy reading and understanding for the examiner. You may use contractions, but it is a poor style to use, in formal English, colloquial language, or slang. So remember, this is a formal process. The interviewer must be detached from the conversation and should not engage in arguments. This does not mean that the issues need not be probed. So leave a line after each response. Your response should be approximately a page, page and a half in length at most. And if you have average handwriting of approximately 10 words per line. Okay, so that is typical guidelines when it comes to an interview. We then move on to the minutes of a meeting or establishing an agenda. So many organizations, groups, and businesses have meetings where records need to be kept of the proceedings and the decisions that are made. So essentially the purpose of taking minutes of the meeting is to keep an accurate record of the events for future possible references. So it needs to be done it's a legal requirement essentially, and it needs to be done in an organized and straightforward fashion. And ultimately, it needs to be done in a way that looks at a couple of questions such as when it took place, who was in attendance, who was absent, what was discussed, and what decisions were made. So now when it comes to the actual process, how much detail is required? Well, the details recorded will depend on the type of meeting and maybe its context. So some organizations like to have a record that captures the spirit of the discussions that took place, while others put their emphasis on the decisions that are made. So with regards to an agenda, in this particular case, it's an agenda that I'm now sharing with you guys that looks at the committee meeting that took place at Craigieburn Social Club. So as you can see, there's a list of components that now define this particular agenda. First and foremost, excuse me, commencement and welcome to those that have now participated in this particular meeting, the adoption of an agenda, apologies, correspondence, minutes of previous meetings, matters arising from minutes, new matters, new project, whatever that project may be, general matters, any other business essentially, and then closure at a particular time. Okay, so we have an example here of the minutes for a committee meeting that was held at Craigieburn Social Club. So as you can see, it was held at the activity room, and it was on Saturday, the 25th of July, 2019. So first and foremost, the commencement and welcome. The meeting commenced at 6 p.m. with a prayer. In the absence of the chairperson, the meeting was chaired by the vice chairperson, Denver Reddy, attendance as per attendance register. So the adoption of an agenda was adopted without any changes on the motion of Nancy Harris and seconded by Thabo Masinga. So this is something that you need to do, get someone to second this particular motion. And then with regards to an apology, anybody that was not able to attend was received from the following: Stella Mkhize, who was the chairperson, away on a conference in this particular case. So the correspondence, a letter was received from the principal of ABC Secondary School, granting permission for future meetings to be held at the school. The House resolved to send a letter of thanks to the principal and members of the school governing body. So the minutes of the previous meeting, anything being mentioned here, the secretary, Peter Beacon, read the minutes of the previous meeting. There being no corrections, the minutes were then adopted on the motion of Bradley Moodley and seconded by Mandla Kuzwayo. Okay, so matters arising from minutes. There were many delays regarding the planned family day at the municipal grounds because of the current strike by municipal workers. After much discussion, it was unanimously resolved to cancel the event. Excuse me. New matters arising. The House approved a proposal by the fundraising subcommittee to host a dinner dance on the 24th of September 2019 at the Oreso Hall. The subcommittee will then meet within 2 days to finalize the preparations. Closure. With no further matters to be attended to, the meeting closed at 7:15 p.m. with a prayer. So this is typically what you would elaborate on now if you decided to now write a piece on a actual, say, agenda that's now being pieced together with the minutes of an actual meeting. So some noteworthy features of transactional pieces, a couple of points that I'd like to share with you guys. So as you can see here, the transactional piece itself, what one can look at are the aspects of tone, the stylistic features, and the must-knows, essentially. So now with regards to these examples, when it comes to an informal or friendly letter, you are essentially expected to write a letter to a friend at one of the universities in light of the Fees Must Fall protest, for example, expressing your concern for his or her safety. The aspect of your tone could be flamboyant and lively. Personal tone must be appropriate to the topic given and the recipient of the letter. You must avoid things like slang and SMS language, but do use lively colloquial expressions. Paragraphs are essential, appropriate introduction and conclusions, and the salutation must be correct, i.e. the actual, say, concluding phase of your particular letter. So we can see that this is not only a case of the actual, say, informal or friendly letter. You can also see that this is making mention of formal letters and letters to the press, stylistic features of letters to the press, clear and straightforward. Note that the formal letter has 2 addresses. There are no contractions or slang that are used. SMS language is acceptable to an extent, but try and avoid it as best as possible. And then a couple of must-knows: you do not deviate from the topic. Because you are addressing the press, they need to know that you are serious about the reasons behind your address, and you don't want to be perceived as someone that is just now barking at something that you don't necessarily know too much about. So you need to essentially do your research. You are then expected to address the press in a kind of professional-like manner. So with regards to obituaries, we mentioned this earlier. Remember, there have been a number of protests in your area, for instance, and the chairperson of the SRC, unfortunately, at this particular university, lost their lives. So the aspects of this tone: a sincere, formal element of factuality to suit the written piece. This is very important. This is someone's life that we're dealing with. It has to be a very serious matter. Avoid any kind of sentimental tone, and don't write anything negative in this particular case. And remember, a eulogy is not the same as an obituary. A eulogy is a speech given at a funeral or a memorial, a personal account of your shared time experiences with your loved ones. Then an actual speech. Well, in this particular example, you are the chairperson of a youth organization. The Child Protection Unit in your area has invited you to deliver a speech on verbal abuse. So with regards to a couple of must-knows, you are to greet your audience. You are to hook the audience by using an engaging introduction or using a quote or a short, captivating sentence. The tone is dependent on the nature of the topic and, of course, your audience. Always a good idea to understand who your audience is, and you need to make use of sincere and enthusiastic and convincing like tones. So with regards to a magazine article, it needs to be factual, objective opinions that could be based on evidence, quotations, references, incidents, statistics, any kind of research that you may have done. Stylistic features, right, so directed to the reader of the article, descriptive and figurative language may be used. You can use short, succinct paragraphs, including a captivating headline and byline. Gangster projects get the green light. The city applauds a new project to combat youth gangsterism in Etequeni. This is by China and Governor. Okay, and then a couple of the must-knows. You must focus on the instruction or the topic. The names, the places, times, positions, and other details may be included, such as who, where, what, where, why, when, and how. And you must be clear about the intention of writing this article. This should come across after your reading piece, after reading your piece, and what is it that you want to achieve? Write an engaging, say, introduction that is now going to hook your audience. Okay, so now with regards to transactional texts, again, it's always a good idea to write and edit a draft text before you produce the final product. Use ideas from the plan, piecing together your thoughts and ideas. Edit the draft by correcting any grammar, punctuation, spelling, and format errors. And then, of course, present that final product with a strong sense of confidence and a strong sense of conviction that is in line with your particular interests at the end of the day. Well, thank you very much. I hope that you guys enjoyed today's lesson on the aspect of English that refers to writing and presenting, specifically focusing on transactional texts. We've gone through a couple of examples of what you could come across when it comes to transactional texts and how you can elaborate on such pieces by looking at things such as style and tone and various other aspects. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.